This landscape was once the sea. After people settled here, disaster struck. Livelihoods vanished, disease took hold, and people began to disappear. What followed was crime, abandonment, and villages lost to time. This is the Romney Marsh, and its history is far darker than people realise.
The sea once stretched across this land, a vast shifting coastal lagoon on the southeast coast of England, formed after the Ice Age. It stretched across the landscape between former historic port towns, partly enclosed by a shingle barrier, while large rivers and waterways twisted around the Weald of Kent and into Sussex. For the people that settled these lands, water was a way of life. That was before disaster struck. When the Romans invaded England, the lagoon became vital. It connected waterways to transport iron, and its brackish waters could create salt. The village of Lymm, now perched on the chalk spine of the North Downs, was once the Roman port town of Portus Lemanus, a harbour town built to guard the lagoon's sea mouth. Other settlements stood on the shingle island, now Dungeness and Lydd. This lagoon was essential to life here, but it lay on the edge of the Saxon shoreline, exposed to seafaring raiders. But the tides were already starting to change. Once the Roman Empire started to collapse and Roman Britain fell into disarray, so did the lagoon. The once great Roman infrastructure, such as the port, crumbled and the waterways and sea defences fell. The natural progression of sediment started to choke the water that was so vital to the people here. By the 12th century, the lagoon had become unstable and shallow. But in the 13th century came a violent change. A series of storms concluding with the Great Storm of 1287. For those on the coast, it would have felt like the apocalypse. For those along the marsh, life changed in an instant. People were drowned, the coast was crushed, the land was reshaped overnight. The coastal port town of Old Winchelsea, once a town of houses, taverns and churches, was dragged into the sea and lost forever. We know where it stood only from the surviving maps. Nothing of the old town remains. Elsewhere, the destructive power rewrote livelihoods. Old Romney was a thriving harbour town connected to the sea by river, but at overnight it had become landlocked. Shingle, mud and churned earth blocked the river, stealing the town's way of life and income in one night. The river diverted to Rye, which still stands today, and replaced Romney as the primary port town. And yet, despite the disasters, the marsh still offered opportunity. Small scattered communities existed among the islands and lands reclaimed from the sea, particularly by farmers. The remaining water of the lagoon was slowly draining away, and flatlands created. What was left of the old sea sat in still water bodies, slow channels and stagnant pools. But this would curse the population for centuries. You see, the reclamation of the marsh took generations. Within that time, water sat in little pools and channels, and this water sat still, slow, stagnant, putrid. The brackish water started to let off smells and create disease. It had gained a reputation as a foul landscape, and with it, its people became sickly, one of the worst in the country. Vicars of the marsh routinely wrote of the foul smells causing them sickness and despair, the distress they had brought their families on by accepting their position, and the desire to leave the marsh behind. The folklore swirled of the marsh as an evil place. But it wasn't without justifications. Records harrowingly show how poor life expectancy was in these parts. At its heights, burials of infants exceeded baptisms. There was a stark contrast between the prospects for those in the marsh compared to in the neighbouring regions. But mortality wasn't just bleak, but erratic and fluctuating, with periods where it would have felt like death suddenly stalked the land. One year, the former shipbuilding village of Appledore on the edge of the marsh saw a tenth of its inhabitants die suddenly. In a sparse community like those across the marsh, it could feel as though people were just vanishing. In such a place, death could silence the land. From the 14th century, the population had dropped a third by 1570, and by 1670, 7 of the churches had been abandoned. The marsh was depopulating. The anguish experienced by the people of the marsh was deterring wealth away, and those that could flee from the curse and the diseases of the marsh did. Like many parts of England, the late medieval period cast a long shadow over the Romney Marsh. When the Black Death reached these low, waterlogged lands in the mid-14th century, it tore through communities. In the written records of the time, we see strange gaps and sudden disruptions, and the plague lingered. The local harbour town of Rye had multiple outbreaks in the 1600s. Animals were slaughtered, plague houses closed off, and gates locked to spur the infection and prevent even further death. But the rural marsh was blighted by something far more mysterious. Detailed in the diary of Dr. Jeremiah Cliff, we've learned of the unfortunate diseases that took those at the former port town of Tenterden during the 1700s. And the dark truth was the primary cause of death was fever, followed closely by consumption. Consumption is recognised as tuberculosis today, but fever is strange, in the way that it was used as a description for many diseases. But in these parts, any of the fever cases likely originated in the putrid waters. So the strange and mysterious disease that many suffered from in these parts was ague, or marsh fever, believed to be from the miasma of stagnant water. What they actually had was malaria from mosquitoes multiplying in the waters. Though adults could survive the affliction, newcomers and infants faced the risk of death from marsh fever, and even survivors would live in a constant state of weakness. To heal, you needed to get purer air, to leave the marsh. And for those that couldn't, the cure was far too expensive, meaning they would turn to alcohol, opium, and other drugs to manage the symptoms. For many of the marsh dwellers, this was likely just one disease amongst many that finally killed them. This is the 800-year-old Fairfield Church of St. Thomas Becket, one of the most famous churches still standing proudly, alone, after surviving all the turmoil that befell the marsh. The church served the medieval Fairfield village, but the plague, illness and silting dramatically reduced the population and likely caused the Fairfield village to be abandoned and lost to time. If you look around, you can see the drainage channels circulating the ground, almost like an island, to manage the water levels, prevent flooding and draining excess water to the sea. And you can also see the sheep, which have for centuries been the main agricultural activity on the marsh and cause of something dark upon these marshes. For you see, in this landscape, stained by death and disease and feared by outsiders, something lurks in the dark and mist. You may only hear the hoot of an owl echoing through the night air. But these were not owls. They were owlers, notorious smugglers who, according to folk legend, used hooting to secretly communicate in the dead of night. As a rural, desolate backwater, shrouded with fear and superstition, and close to the continent, smuggling was lucrative. In the dead of night, under the thick of dark and mist, owlers covered their face and traversed the marsh using their knowledge of hidden spots and tracks to evade the authorities while smuggling wool. To be caught would mean capital punishment. But in the vast, quiet expanse of the marsh, one could disappear. And the smugglers had their tricks. The old churches that sat alone across the marsh provided ample hiding spaces for the hiding of goods. And as smugglers were often deeply rooted within the local communities, the priests could also be in on the act, helping hide goods and the smugglers. But they were dangerous people too, and murder wasn't unheard of amongst the most dangerous gangs. Marred with environmental disaster that destroyed livelihoods, riddled with disease and plagued by crime, the marsh was seen as a lawless and evil place, a problematic land that no doctor could heal, no priest could bless, or no power could control. Across the marsh, some of the evidence still exists in the grounds and channels dug, in the relics of old communities and the old ways of life across the marsh. The marsh now thrives, but the lost sacrifice and suffering of those that built this place is partly forgotten. Like the sea that once flowed and vanished, so did the people that endured and built what exists today. And what is in store for the future of the marsh, only time will tell.